So we are now live, folks. Welcome to Operating During COVID-19, a panel of those who carried on during this very interesting time, nearly unique time, not entirely unique in history, but if it's once every 100 years, it's certainly unique in our lifetimes. This is an event sponsored by the Chamber of Commerce of Newark and Axia Global, part of the Chamber of Commerce's Newark Rising series. My name is Zahir Ali. I'm your moderator today, and we have a wonderful panel of companies, representatives that maintain their operations throughout this period. And we're hoping that you all can learn from what they've done, and that all of us together can find ways to continue to operate under these interesting circumstances and continue to do what we do as businesses best, which is to keep people working and drive the progress and prosperity of the communities in which we do business. So coronavirus, what coronavirus? Well, if it's there, we have to keep calm and carry on. Whether it takes sticking our shirt over our nose and spraying the air, or doing some more interesting things. I think we're going to hear about the more interesting things today. But fundamentally, what this panel is about, and our event today is about, is how to keep going and not let what's going on derail the progress of our economies. The panelists are an amazing group. Roger Tang, a PhD of Triple Ring Technologies, which is a contract research company dealing primarily in medical devices, but actually has a wide variety of work that they do. Ben Beneski of Allogene Therapeutics, which is developing gene therapeutics. Daniel Witt of Lucid Motors, the first true luxury electric vehicle. George Szabo of TechZero, which is a infrastructure, electronics infrastructure company, whether it's IT, security, access control, all of which kept working during this time. My name is Zahir Ali. I'm your moderator today. I work for the University Space Research Association on NASA contracts and also with Axia Global. Thank you guys so much for being here today. And really, as we go forward in this discussion, I just want people to kind of have a frame of mind of what we're going to be thinking about. There are a lot of issues to consider while operating during COVID-19. Employee safety, maintaining facilities. There are also legal issues. How do you do construction and expand if you had expansion plans? How do you maintain compliance as new regulations are being brought down, as local, state, and federal requirements are changing? Sometimes it seems on an hourly, if not daily basis. How do you interact with the public? And how do you introduce new products? Those are just a few of the considerations that we're going to talk about today. And thankfully, that's all I have in terms of slides. What we're going to do now is I'm just going to turn it over to our panelists to introduce themselves, say a few words about who they are, their companies, and the general approach that they took to working through COVID. So perhaps I could ask George to lead us off.
Sure. My name is George Szabo, and I'm CEO and principal partner for TechZero. We do 724, basically 724 technology support for a variety of businesses. Just to give you kind of what kind of businesses those would be. We support a lot of very high-end clients out of Beverly Hills, Los Angeles, with parent companies throughout the country. We've interacted with a lot of other companies there as well, including WeWorks. We have stock brokerages. We have high-end showrooms for, high-touch, high-end apparel and furniture. I know it sounds kind of funny, but I'm mentioning that for a reason, because it's a different type of business model that we have to deal with. Pluto TV is another one that we're actually looking to work with, and they're in with all of our other clients. And we do call center support. We've had a lot of call centers, including those that are involved with suicide hotlines, drug abuse, rehab, all of which have picked up a lot of business over the past 3 to 4 months. So the demand has actually gone up. I'm not saying it's a good thing. I just thought I would mention that, from a different perspective, right? That while some businesses are struggling, others are having to deal with increased demand. And so that's kind of our, in general, that's basically what we do, is provide the IT infrastructure for that and support, which includes everything from, like Zaire said, access control, cameras, security, phone systems, bandwidth, networks, all of that, whatever's required.
Thanks, George. What's interesting is that you mentioned a variety of very critical systems that people are relying on, such as a suicide hotline. That can't go down even during a pandemic. So it's really interesting. Adjacent to that are activities such as research and development. So I'd like to perhaps toss it over to Ben next, and just see kind of what your thoughts are, and if you'd like to introduce yourself, please, and go ahead and tell us a little bit about Allogene.
Yeah, thanks Zahir, and thanks to the Chamber of Commerce for hosting this and for inviting me to be part of the panel. I'm Ben Beneski. I'm the manufacturing plant manager for Allogene and the facility that we're building here in Newark. Allogene Therapeutics is a clinical stage biotechnology company. We're pioneering the development of allogeneic chimeric antigen receptor T cell, or what we call AlloCAR T therapies for cancer. We started in April 2018 with a focus to bring the revolution of off-the-shelf CAR T cell therapy to patients. The first revolution in cell therapy was autologous CAR T cell therapy. That involves collecting a patient's white blood cells, sending them to a manufacturing facility, genetically engineering the T cells to recognize and kill cancer cells, and then those reprogrammed cells are sent back and infused into the patient. But at Allogene, our T cells are allogeneic, which means they're derived from healthy donors and intended for use in any patient, rather than from an individual patient for that patient's use, like I described for autologous T cells. We think this key difference will enable us to deliver readily available cell therapy faster and more readily into more patients. We started in 2018 with about 40 researchers, and today we're now a leading pioneer in the allogeneic cell therapy field with about 250 employees and a pipeline of product candidates that target both blood and solid tumors, with 4 therapies in phase 1 and 2 more on the horizon. We're building our state-of-the-art GMP manufacturing facility in Newark, California, right across from Lucid Motors, pretty much. And that will enable us to provide in-house manufacturing, quality assurance, and quality control to ensure a reliable supply of our products for clinical programs and for our future commercial products. And all of the work we're doing has one goal in mind, to be the first to bring this important new therapy to patients who are suffering from cancer. And that mission is really what drives us to, and how we've worked through the COVID-19 challenges. We haven't stopped treating cancer patients with our therapies and our clinical studies. We've continued manufacturing, although we're still building our facility in Newark. The construction there is still continuing, and we're making progress. So I think that mission to serve patients and to get these life-saving therapies to patients is really what's driven us through this time. And our basis in science has also driven how we've responded to a lot of the challenges that we faced in the last few months.
Thanks, Ben. Really, it's wonderful to have you. Roger, could you perhaps give us a little bit of a description of Triple Ring and also about your role there?
Sure. Thanks for inviting us here, Zahir, and happy to be here. And obviously, we've been in Newark now almost 12 years as a company, almost since its founding. I'm Roger Tang. I'm actually Senior Vice President of the Science Systems and Engineering Group at Triple Ring Technologies. And what that means is I'm essentially responsible for making sure we have the right technical resources at the right time for all the different projects that we do at Triple Ring. If you're wondering what Triple Ring is a scientifically focused product development company. We basically develop products. We have about 100 full-time employees and an additional 25 to 50 consultants and contractors as projects come and go in our portfolio. So the interesting thing about Triple Ring is that in addition to having sort of more traditional engineering talent around mechanical engineering, electrical, and software, a full 1/3 of our team is actually more in the sciences. So we actually have support in physics, optics, biology, bioengineering, chemistry. So the kinds of projects that we do sort of span more than just traditional engineering. It's true R&D. And so what do we do is we actually work with various innovators and entrepreneurs to essentially solve their hard problems and to launch breakthrough products, and then in some cases create brand new businesses. We work with startups. We also work with pretty well-known Fortune 100 companies to usually complement or sometimes be their complete research development engineering team. We primarily work in the medical technologies and life science spaces. That's probably 95% of what we do. But we've done things like put a camera in space and develop something as interesting as a marijuana breathalyzer. So we do a lot of interesting R&D work and ultimately develop products. So where are we? We're actually in Newark, obviously, off Stevenson, where we have an 88,000 square foot facility. We also have a 12,000 square foot facility in downtown Boston. And we actually have individuals scattered throughout the world as part of our team. If you look at our facility, it's an interesting space. I'm happy to give a tour when we can. About half of our space is actually dedicated to sort of engineering, optics, biology, and chemistry, sort of more traditional lab product development space. And then the other half is either open cubicles or offices and conference rooms. In our space, we actually have about 25% of it dedicated to incubating with our clients and partners. So it's not just us, it's some of our partner companies also in that space. So we have a very, very dynamic mixed use space that has all sorts of things going on and that span the gamut of product development. In March, I have to tell you, we transitioned from almost completely 100% work in the office, work in the lab company to one that's very different today. We almost 95% of us actually aren't on site. So it was a complete transition for us. But interestingly, we made that transition overnight with almost no hiccup. And that's the general approach that we applied then and still apply today. We have folks basically work from home when they can, but when they have to come into the offices and the labs to work on the systems that we're developing, that they do it safely. And that I'm happy to answer any other questions as we go through this process, because it was just an interesting challenge, but also a surprising challenge for us. And we were actually shocked at how well we made that transition.
Thanks, Roger. There's definitely going to be time to hear about how exactly that worked, because it sounds like it was rather amazingly done. Another company that continued to crank through was Lucid Motors, and it's interesting. We've got medical side research, very much offsite operations and installation and implementation, and Lucid is a different company in that they are a designer and manufacturer of vehicles. So very much kind of in a backbone type of economic sector that employs a lot of people in for different ways. So, Daniel Witt is here representing them, and we'd love to hear more about who you are, Daniel, and Lucid Motors as well.
And hi, everyone. Thank you very much for attending this. It's great to be associating with so many people from the immediate vicinity, admittedly from each of our respective residences or workplaces remotely. This is the challenge for today, right? So for what it's worth, I head up the public policy for Lucid, and I'm a relatively recent addition to the company. In a prior life, I spent 7 years with Tesla, helping to build that company. And before that, I actually worked for Senator Dianne Feinstein in her Washington, D.C. office, working on legislation for the state. So most of my career has been spent at the intersection of government and business. And as you can imagine, as reflective of my recent hiring with Lucid, The company is in a rather transitional state at the moment, where it's moving from being strictly an R&D manufacturing and technology company to a more fully fledged automaker. Our global headquarters is in Newark, which is where we occupy a roughly 300,000 square foot space, and we're actually building across the street now to expand both our R&D capabilities as well as our ability to have a larger workforce presence, albeit from a safe distance, as we're able to bring people back into the office. You may have heard that we made some news today. Busy news day, but we announced this morning that the vehicle behind me is going to have a fully electric range of 517 miles. This blows through the projections not only for this company as well as for the industry as a whole. Our manufacturing facility is in Arizona, and we'll be bringing this car to market to customers early next year. That makes this time, this year, an extremely sensitive period for the company, one which relies on execution at really its finest in order to meet all of the demands and bring this car to market efficiently. As you can imagine, there's a great deal of spend that goes into building the prototype and beta versions of these cars. There's about 20 beta vehicles that are used for diagnostic testing that were built actually in-house in Newark, and that are being driven around now and doing all kinds of testing. This was actually one of the principal challenges we faced, and I'll get into this more further into the program, but how do we actually conduct testing in a vehicle, let alone manufacturing by hand these vehicles in this shelter-in-place and COVID environment. Needless to say, though, we are full steam ahead. Continuing to, and really did draw back on our overall presence. Like the speaker before, there was a heavy emphasis, not only from an operational standpoint, but from a cultural standpoint in terms of being in the office and working collaboratively with your colleagues. This was heavily emphasized in the engineering departments, as you can imagine, as they were working iteratively on the product. I am also pleased to say that we pulled an about face and 180 degrees, and at the start of shelter in place, removed 95+% of the people from the office. I'd say maybe 20% of our workforce has progressively moved back in, but that's been done with great care and for the individuals, and we've developed a pretty comprehensive plan, which again I'll be sure to talk about a little later, to enable that progression. I think you might be on mute there.
The number one Google search in March, unmute. Felt subject to it myself there. Really quickly before we jump in, if we could just poll, maybe folks, if you could drop it into the chat. Just it'd be interesting for, I think, a lot of us to see who, when March, that last week of February and then March, as the lockdown started to kind of fall like dominoes across cities, counties, states, and then the nation. How many of you felt that your office was in any way ready for it? Maybe you could just, if you felt that there was a seamless transition, maybe put in a 3 in the chat. If you felt that it was kind of okay, put 2. If it was rough, put 1. If it was a complete disaster, maybe put 0. It'd be interesting just to see kind of from our different attendees here what you guys felt. So we got a 2 and a 3. Anybody else? 3 from Roger. Yeah, that was great. give folks another minute. So 0 being the worst, basically, and 3 being pretty easy. Okay, so it sounds like there were some people who did all right. Great, 2s and 3s showing up in the chat. Maybe the people who are at 0 and 1 are feeling shy, which is fair. So the question then, the first one that I would like to pose to the panel is in general, how did your companies enter the COVID situation, and how did that enable you or create challenges to continuing work? How ready were you? What worked? What didn't? What important lessons learned did you take from that first month of figuring out what to do? Because you guys didn't stop. So clearly you figured some things out pretty quickly. At this point, I think, I don't have a mic to pass around like we normally would if we were all seated on stage. So I think I'll just say, if somebody wants to jump in, go for it.
I'll start.
George?
Yeah. So obviously the first 2 weeks of the shutdown, everything stopped, so people were just standing still. Since most of what we do is part of new build outs, for infrastructure and that kind of stuff, buildings, new buildings, etc., it was deemed an essential, work. So, we continued to do the work that we were asked to do. And there wasn't any change, actually, to be honest with you. We typically wear masks on site anyways because of paint, sanding, and other types of things that are in the air when you're doing that kind of work. And those masks, to be honest with you, are probably about, they're significantly better than the masks we see most people wearing today. I just say that. But here's the thing. Here's what happened. The first thing that got impacted was cash flow. So, yeah, we could work, yeah, we could be out on site and we could do whatever we were doing. But the fact of the matter is that we're reliant on our customers who are reliant on their customers, and everything's kind of, glued together. So as people get impacted at different points in that food chain, it all ripples down. So the first thing that impacted us was cash flow. Accounts receivables, who's paying their bills, who's not paying their bills, how do we pay our bills? And the next thing that happened immediately after that was that the finance departments of every business that we interact with struggled to adapt whatever they had to do in order to continue to operate. You go, why is that? These people deal with finances, money, it's all digital to a great extent. I mean, why would it be difficult? Why would they have problems? And the reason that we found is that to a great extent, people leverage delays in the payment systems to control cash flow. And so when you go from a paper check that's mailed out that's delayed, by 1, 2, 3, 5 working days, business days, to an electronic deposit, which exits the account immediately, that completely affects your ledger. And so that was the number one thing that we saw spike right after people started getting back to, initially the first 2 weeks, everybody just said, hey, we don't know what's going on, so we're not paying anything. And, obviously we'll cash whatever you give us. That was kind of the attitude. But as it flowed into April, that's when there started being issues. And a lot of companies weren't even able to execute properly on their accounts receivable and payables until late March and June. So we're still seeing some of that. People switched to automatic payments for the short term, like, hey, give us your bank account, that kind of stuff. But they've rolled back now in August to sending checks out. So, I know it sounds kind of boring, money, but the fact of the matter is that all businesses are built on cash flow. And when you interrupt that cash flow, that significantly impacts the complete and total operation, from paychecks to, checks that you get for the process, for the services and products that you own. So that was the first thing. The second thing that we found was that the work that people had contracted to do in March, they held on to, and they didn't actually do it. Anything they could stop, they stopped. And then in May, they had to decide, do we keep doing this? And a lot of them said, well, we should finish these tinier projects, but anything else that we do has to be reshaped in order to, be relevant to what has just happened. So all of a sudden, any project that could be canceled was, anything small that could be completed was, and then the bidding process for all the rest of the work extended through June and July. So it isn't until now in August when people are actually starting to implement projects. And for us, all those projects have become focused around enhanced processes to support either local, state, or federal guidance for getting back to work. So primarily, and we never did this much work, it's almost 80% of what we're doing now, is access control and tracking. That's like boom, it's like there. It's like that's the main thing. And that's being driven, I'm going to say it's split, but I really think split between concern for the employee, but I think it's primarily a need to mitigate the legal liability of having people come back to work. So part of it is convincing people to come back to work, so they're doing this. But the other part is, what is our legal liability when people come back to work to make sure that we don't get sued or, that kind of stuff. So that's kind of where we're at and what's happened.
Thanks, George. Who else would like to jump in on the readiness or and kind of how that initial how you entered? Ben, I saw you bring yourself up.
Yeah, I can jump in. I mean, I don't think anyone was ready for for really truly prepared for what COVID-19 brought. And yet we all had to respond to it. And so I'm sure every one of us has heard the cliche, we're building the plane, we're designing the plane, building the plane while we're flying it. And this whole situation has really highlighted the need to be agile. And the benefit of having, we're fortunate we have people with a lot of people with industry experience, and so having that solid experience base sort of helps with this agility. But a few examples of things that were just really dynamic. The initial shelter-in-place orders were changing, kind of week to week, and they weren't necessarily aligned between the state orders and the local county orders, and the county orders weren't all aligned. And so, there was definitely a period initially where, we were all just checking the websites to see if anything changed with regards to what activities were essential and what controls needed to be in place. So that was very dynamic. And, I think the supply chains were also very dynamic. As I mentioned, we're doing construction in Newark, and we're relying on a lot of other suppliers to give us construction materials. And we've had situations where the paint we spec'd, the factory that makes that paint had to shut down because they had someone test positive, and now we can't get the paint, and we've got to pick a different paint. And it seems like something simple, and it's certainly not the most complex example, but it highlights those things that you could take for granted with regards to your supply chain, whether for construction materials or supplies or whatever. We're changing, day to day, and the need to be super agile was really highlighted through everything in this situation.
Yeah, I would echo that notion of being agile. I think that's essentially what allowed us to sort of pass through the transition with almost no hiccup. I mean, one of the things about the company, Triple Ring Technologies, is that we work on a lot of different projects, spanning projects that take one or two people to ones that take dozens of folks in the team. And what allowed us to make the transition, I think, was really that agility. And it's part of the culture of the way we have the team set up. We have this mindset that we always like to talk about, that we like to see our teams as being Marines. We give them the guardrails for the rules for which they have to go out and do their work, but everyone knows who the captain is, and the team understands that they move as a team. And so what we did from day one was really realize that those teams' captains had to be brought together to communicate so that they could coordinate at the high level. So one of the things that we did from day one was to really have daily stand-ups with those captains, the leaders of the projects, and the functional managers that would be involved in supplying the team members to those captains. And literally what we did was we just had daily stand-ups. And it kept us together, kept us communicating, but it absolutely coordinated the teams, because below the captains, they would basically manage the team. So I think that transition was key for us. The other transition point that was key for us is, as an executive team, we got together and we set up, what are the different pillars that we had to deal with as we had to make this transition. We knew that communication was absolutely the most important thing. So we try to over communicate as much as possible. And then there are other aspects of the business that we just try to coordinate on. But I think the key was really having those agile teams that, that synced up at the right time, that allowed us to make the transition pretty cleanly. And we continue to have those stand-ups today. And it's a great sort of like a standard check. You get into this rhythm that we never had before. We never did this before. But now that we made the transition, I don't see why we would never do this, not do this ever. We would continue to have these kinds of teams coordination. So that was definitely a big learning for us, that we're learning ways to be even more efficient than we were before. And that mostly around that agile aspect of it.
Very interesting. Thank you, Roger. Daniel, certainly we're happy to have, I'm interested in how Lucid moved in that, but I was also wondering if you could jump into kind of question 2, since you're a bit of more than slightly a bit an expert in terms of how you navigated working with the local, states, and national officials, as well as also employee representation throughout this process. Because I know that with us at NASA and USRA, we've got a very highly technical workforce that is themselves going out and reading every bit of literature they can find. And I imagine Lucid has, and really, all of your companies have those types of workforces. So they're possibly telling management, this is what we want to see. So, kind of how to navigate all those different stakeholders, and how perhaps Lucid approached it, and what lessons you've learned from there.
Yeah, actually, it's kind of a great transition from the first question to the second, because the second really played a heavy role in how we had adjusted initially. And here, it's a great observation in terms of the different stakeholders and that were involved in the decision making. We have a highly technical workforce with an emphasis on engineering, people who are inquisitive and ultimately do their own research. But at the end of the day, it didn't really matter what their opinion was. It mattered what the regulations said and how the legal team was able to analyze and basically understand the regulations coming out of the Alameda County Health Department, some of which, of course, were coming from the state level. But at the very beginning, manufacturing was not a part of the essential workforce. So we drew our operations back heavily based on our respect for what County Health was putting out. That didn't stop us from engaging with County Health, but it meant that we had a short staff in our warehousing department, and basically everybody else was told to go home. And that includes the engineers who were working on the beta vehicles at the time. Over the next several weeks, we started to, as the regulations started to come out more iteratively, we gained a little bit more comfort with doing certain things. But I'll tell you that there were some critical areas when I first came aboard, where manufacturing still was not part of the classified as part of the essential workforce, where we very much needed to move forward in terms of the driving of the vehicles. And you can imagine driving a vehicle can be a rather solitary job, but for the fact that in pre-production vehicles, there's a strong preference for having 2 people in the vehicle at all times. We ultimately needed to modify the vehicles to put plexiglass to separate the front of the cabin from the back of the cabin in order to basically reconcile the local county health order and demonstrate that we embraced all of the precautions that were trying to be put in place by by local governance. It helped to a degree, candidly, that we were able to reach out and work with Alameda County Public Health through this process. And with having demonstrated our receptivity to their conditions, there were obviously other employers who are also doing manufacturing who did not were very public in terms of their displeasure about the regulations, and not to besmirch anybody, but I found that, you know, a little bit of honey went a lot longer, went a lot farther in terms of getting the support from the county to know what was going to be, what was going to meet the merit of what the regulations were putting out. And as is true in almost every, with almost every piece of legislation, what's codified into law rarely keeps up with technology or medicine, and frankly at the pace that we're all going at in this stage. So having a consistent dialogue with county public health, with legislators and staff in Sacramento really proved crucial to our ability to stay on target with our pre-production activities.
Very, very interesting. I'm curious as to compare whether our other panelists have different experiences or took different tacks to that same question. If anybody would like to jump in.
Fortunately, we're 95% of what we do is life sciences medical, and our lawyers sort of told us after reading sort of all those things that came out right at the very beginning that we were still considered an essential business. And we did stop some projects or slow some projects down that were not as medically related. We actually also started doing more COVID projects. And that was also sort of a byproduct of us being involved in a lot of diagnostic type of technology development. So in some respects, we definitely kept going, especially supporting our COVID-related projects. We actually built out, during the time in March, we actually built out a new lab to do specifically live COVID virus work. So we fortunate for us, you know, it's what we do. So we were able to continue to go as a company because of that. So we were just lucky, I guess.
So I'll jump in here. There are three things that we encountered because we support a whole variety of businesses doing a variety of different things. Guidance versus mandate versus law. So guidance, you know, people would take that into consideration. We know we had a lot of guidance, especially from the federal government. Mandates coming out of the state and or local government, and then there's law. So we've always dealt with law, OSHA, you know, with regards to the work environment for employees, et cetera. But what was interesting is that during this period of time, those weren't really the issue. The issue was policing. So in other words, it doesn't matter what guidance or mandate or law you have. If you can't police it, it really doesn't matter. Because it's the policing that allows for it to actually have any, you know, let's say to be implemented or have validity. So since people were in confusion, they did the things that they first thought they could be policed at. So things like masks, very visual, that kind of thing. But the real policing didn't come from the government, at least for all the different clients that we had. The policing came from the employees and the customers. So they were the touch points. If I want these employees to work for me or do work I asked them to do, they're the ones that are going to be the first to challenge me on how they interpret the guidance, the mandate, or the laws. And I'm not saying they're always right, but that's where that first, blow comes from, especially in confusion. The second one was from the customer, who will do the same thing the employee did, except that they actually, instead of you don't pay the customer, the customer pays you. So, those are really the two forces that are enforcing whatever guidance, mandate, or laws are really relevant to what's going on today. So what is the result of that? What I've seen in our clients is that there's two main actions that are taking place. One is that they are actually procuring more space. So we had a lot of clients that had procured space and were subcontracting out, let's say half of a 50,000 square foot facility. They were going to take, let's say, 30,000 and sublease out 20,000 of it. Now they're just keeping the whole thing because they can spread out and use the space more effectively. There's no concerns there. So that's like the first thing. The second thing is that with the space that more of it is independent access to the building, because typically they would have people that were would sit at the door opens, people come in, they sign on a pad that they're there. It's like a very, very face-to-face type control of people coming into facilities. And now what they don't want that. Now what they want is independent access to areas, minimize contact, and that all has to be done through improved access control, tracking, those kinds of things, which people really didn't invest in before. So those are the two major things that I see, and it's across all businesses. I see that. The third thing, I'm going to throw this third one in. I'd love to hear what the other panelists say about this. I'm getting feedback that people say that this work at home stuff isn't working. They are not getting the productivity that they need. They're not getting the creative interaction that they're used to having. The ability to get that kind of juice going, it just isn't happening. And so to a great extent, they're all really looking for creative and proactive ways to get people back together. Whether it starts with the people who aren't concerned, but still complying legally, versus those who maybe have elderly parents or other special situations or elderly themselves, but I'm just saying that's what I'm hearing. I'm not hearing, hey, we all got to stay home and, this is great and let's do this forever. I'm not hearing that.
So thank you, George. That's really interesting. I was going to ask you, Ben, but I think you're anticipating it. You're a plant manager at some level. So yeah, I'm really interested. I think we're all interested in your perspective on exactly that.
Yeah, I mean, we work, in biologics manufacturing, we work in a highly regulated industry, which, ensures that the products we make are safe and effective for our patients. And so, a lot of the controls that were put in place around shelter in place and COVID-19 risk mitigation, operating in that space is an area that we were comfortable with. So we were following all of the, all the recommendations from OSHA and CDC and Alameda County. And I think beyond just following the regulations, like you were saying, George, there's a certain perspective of, we need to not just, following the letter of the law is one thing, but what makes all the employees feel safe and comfortable in coming back to work? Because, you can't just follow the guidelines and expect everybody to come back. You have to create a level of comfort and safety. And that's where I think in both our lab operations and our construction site, besides just following the regulations, really had a lot of communications and, to understand how those controls are impacting the people and getting, that keeping up the communication and understanding, what's working and adapting the plans. The setup we had initially is not the same exact setup that we have now, all compliant, but we've been adaptive to understand, how are these controls working with our workforce and what's making people feel comfortable or uncomfortable. To the previous point, Daniel, you were talking about engagement with local agencies and things. I think we went through the same thing and worked really closely and appreciate the support from the city of Newark as we were, working on our plans for managing our construction. So I think it's not just making, we see it as not just our employees, but we're a member of the community, and what can we do to also keep the community safe? And how do we engage to make sure that we're following the rules and doing everything we can to create a safe environment for our work to continue was something that was really important for us.
So I would like to stay with that topic just for a minute longer, even though we do have another question that we could jump into, because George, you and Ben brought up kind of pulled a thread that is counter a big assumption people are making. There's a lot of rhetoric in news sources, even ones as reputable as The Economist and Wall Street Journal, about how there's going to be this massive reduction in commercial real estate usage. But George, your experience is actually opposite that. Instead, it's that no, actually they want more space so that they can be more spread out. And Ben, what we're learning from you is that that there are certain things that are just indispensable. You can't do this work from home. It's not manufacturing, but it still must be done in person. So I just want to throw that out to the panel. As where do what are your thoughts about how this might go moving forward? Because there are two tensions here, right? Up here, down south of us in Silicon Valley, right? Google, Facebook, Yahoo, all the big software houses have already told their people, Cisco, you're home till 2021. That's it. They're already looking at drawing back leases. Google is already pulling back on spaces that they've leased that were their overflow areas, and yet on the other side, particularly like I think where you're working, George, with a lot of creative folks, they need that interaction, right? That's where the Medici effect happens, of bringing people with orthogonal thinking together, and particularly in research and innovation. I think all five of us are in that space in some way. We know that's where the power is. So just your thoughts on how this might evolve in the next 6, 12, 18, and 24 months, whatever timeline you'd like to think about. Jump in, please. Any of you.
Well, we have an example. The idea of needing more space is interesting. So we're on a construction site, and we have construction trailers. If anybody's worked on a construction site before, it's kind of familiar. Yes. We were thinking, we have plenty of space. We can fit more people, and we've been hiring, continued hiring and onboarding. But the need to spread people out has actually been a big challenge. And now we're to the point where we might need to add a couple of trailers until we can get into the building to have enough space, and we may need to keep people spread out across a larger area for a longer time, because like you said, we have a lot of people, we can't do manufacturing, we can't do lab experiments from home. So I think there could be a need for more space in the near term, as we have people that need to come back but need to be spread out more. I could certainly see that continuing. And I think we also probably all thought this was going to be a lot shorter than it has been. But are maybe coming around to the idea that some of this is going to continue for a while, and maybe even some of it in a positive way. We do have people that can work from home. I'm home now. I'm not on site 100% of the time right now, but I think we've learned a lot about how to work remotely effectively by being forced to do it for so many months. Like Roger was saying, they've got ways of communication and daily huddles that they'll probably keep doing forever. So it's not all just negative impact.
Yeah, definitely on our side, we actually conducted a survey some amount of time after it first started. I can't remember exactly which month it was. May have been a month or two into it, just to sort of see how people were settling in. And it's an interesting result. I mean, certainly about half the people really like the flexibility to work from home, and I think that's something that we know we're probably not going to get away from, because if it's going to make them happy and productive, why not continue to do it? And then there's certainly a section of our folks that really want that interactive work that happens only when groups get together. So we're going to have an interesting transition, and we're going to have to figure out how to balance it. Certainly, it won't be like it was, and that's going to be true. We do have a large space. We're going to take advantage of that in the near term, obviously. And if people want to come in, they do come in, and there's the space for them to do their work. But I think we're going to go through an interesting transition for folks in the sort of hands-on research development manufacturing business, because you have to be there, but yet there's actually fractions of the folks that actually do better off-site, at least some of the time. And so I think it's going to be a challenge for us, and I think for everyone, to figure out that right balance. We certainly miss being in the building, but we also recognize that it's, you don't always have to be in the building to be productive.
Yeah. And Daniel, I think you were also, thank you, Roger. Daniel, you were also going to jump in, right?
Yeah, actually, to the topic that was addressed regarding construction, I think I alluded to the fact that we're building across the street right now with the idea of that being additional office space. The idea was to pack more people in, but now what we're anticipating moving forward is this sort of gradual procession of certain departments coming back into the office and occupying that space, but needing to be spread out. So we'll still have utility for that, and it's considered a worthy investment, but it is not going to have the same functionality as was originally anticipated. And that is actually, I think, a direct result of the success that we've had with transitioning certain portions of our workforce to working from home predominantly, to the point where we can depend on doing that, so long as, frankly, the culture continues to embrace it. Part of what made it so successful in the short term was that leadership not only emphasized the importance of doing it for purposes of safety, but followed that up with protocols that allowed people to stay connected. Our CEO instituted weekly all-hands meetings where he provided updates and asked the VPs of various departments to do the same. Disclosures and topics of conversation that ultimately the workforce would not have been privy to if everyone had been in the office. So there were ways that communication actually, especially from the top down, was increased. And provided that those protocols can continue, I think that maintains the connectivity between the different staffs. As we transition back to a place where, with fingers crossed, the virus reaches some level of being controlled, there's a certain confidence with bringing folks back. I fully expect us to do that, but we'll do it extremely slowly, and with the understanding, frankly, that as was just said, there are going to be some people that, frankly, are just going to be more comfortable and feel, frankly, more productive working from home. I'm a pretty good test case in this respect, in that Lucid represents the shortest commute from my home in Oakland that I've had in over a decade. And yet, I start my workday earlier, working from home and end it later, just by virtue of not having the Bay Area commute, even in its current sort of modified form. And I think we'll find that there are a lot of conversations going on, that way. I have to contend with the fact that I operate out of our garage, and I don't know that I'm going to enjoy doing that quite as much when it's 50 degrees outside and there's there's much less natural light. But these are the ongoing challenges that I think we'll all face as we're working through sort of this evolving process.
All right, thank you, folks. Oh, sorry, George, please.
Yeah, what I was going to say is this, and it's nothing against the panel, but if I were to go through all you guys and rate you on a scale of 1 to 6 as far as digital maturity, you'd all be at a 6, and that means the top. And the problem is that you represent probably the top 2% of companies that are operating today. The other 98% aren't at that level. And so we have to remember that because of that, the ability to execute your task or whatever it is, it's really dependent on these personal relationships and this interaction, even to the point of chemistry that happens between individuals, pheromones, all that stuff. I know it sounds crazy, but there's all these dynamics that people have from being in a space together. We forced that apart. And what we're seeing is a 600% increase in suicide. We're seeing all kinds of terrible things happen. It's because people aren't made to operate that way and they need that interaction. Now, I'm not saying they can't get it from their family. Of course, divorces have gone up. but the point is this. Russia just came out today, said they have a vaccine. Okay, I wouldn't take it. It's from Russia, but I'm just saying they've already come out and said it. Moderna has sold millions and millions of a vaccine that isn't out yet, but will be. I mean, there's all kinds of things happening that are going to mitigate the issues that we're all contending with today. As that happens, that'll allow more and more for us to go back to personal interaction, spaces that are closer together, more of that human interaction, which I personally think is great. Now, with that said, that doesn't mean we have to discard all the good things that we've discovered from doing this exercise. You know, people can work remotely. You can integrate talent from anywhere in the world. You know, it doesn't have to be right next door, you know, walking distance to the office. So there's a lot of good. And I think the next steps we're going to see over the next 3 to 6 months is how we decipher what we've learned from this experience that we still want to keep, even if we don't have to. It's like, well, wait a minute. Even though we can go back to being in close quarters, I don't want to lose the briefings from the CEO, or, you know, these meetings that we have, or, you know, those kinds of things. That's going to be the next real exercise, I think.
Thank you. I want to ask the panel one last quick question before we open it up for questions, which will be right after this. But one thing that I've heard from at least, I'm pretty sure Daniel and Ben, is that you got both Lucid and Allogene have been onboarding people during this time. And it might be interesting to have a very brief, because we do want to leave some time for Q&A. I've already gotten a couple of requests for questions through the chat, so we want to leave some time for that. What has been your experience, technique, and you know, effectiveness in dealing with both any possible layoffs, attrition, and of course the fun part, which is hiring?
Yeah, we've had more of the fun part. You know, for our facility in Newark, we've onboarded about 25 people since the whole shelter-in-place situation began, and it was definitely weird at first. You know, going from in-person interviews to online. Although, you know, we implemented, our HR department implemented surveys post-interview to get feedback from candidates on how we were doing, and we heard actually a lot of positive feedback, in that it gives both the interviewers and the applicants a lot more flexibility in scheduling versus having to fly or come out for an in-person interview. So there were even some positives there. And then for onboarding, I think, like you were saying, George, you know, there's a certain, onboarding is really tough, and if you can't do it face-to-face, it's really hard. And so we just, you know, dialed up the communication dial to 11. And just started inviting more people to meetings, making sure that the new people at our town hall meetings with our whole groups together, we'd introduce all the new people and do some, you know, silly little icebreaker or something, you know, show us your favorite mug and introduce yourself, to just get them as part of the team. And funny, I had this weird experience a couple weeks ago where I was talking to somebody in our construction trailer, and I realized it was the first time we had met face-to-face. Somebody on my team interviewed remotely, onboarded remotely, but we had seen each other on video conferences and gone through enough of these formal and informal events remotely that when we were on site, it felt like we knew each other, kind of. So it's possible. It's a little tricky, but if you can, you know, keep the communication dial turned up to 11, it'll make it easier.
If you don't mind me asking, what positions were those for?
We've a bunch of different positions. Most recently, actually today, we just had 4 manufacturing associates. The people who will work on our manufacturing floor, running our processes, just started today. We've had managers start. We've had people in our quality assurance and quality control groups, people that work in the lab, so they've actually gotten in to go into the labs. Kind of a wide range of positions at different levels.
Yeah, I can jump in as well and just say that we're very proud of the fact that we didn't have to we didn't let go of anybody during the most sensitive period. In fact, we did continue to hire. That has continued. We're benefited, frankly, by having investors and being in pre-production, so the spend is anticipated. So we're not as subject to the cash flow element that was previously mentioned. So that helps tremendously in that range. We passed 1,000 people at the Newark facility during the crisis, and have just continued to hire in what are strategic positions up and down the chain of command by necessity. At the end of the day, and this kind of brings it full circle, but at the end of the day, we're building the plane as we're flying it. We're doing what we need to do. We're hiring in legal. We're hiring in all kinds of the G&A areas. We're hiring additional engineers. We're hiring manufacturing associates that are being trained here, and then transitioning down to Arizona. We haven't even talked about that, but the different regulations between different states and how that impacts different operations is very we all kind of know the sophistication there. So all that is to say, I have to give tremendous credit to our HR department, which has done yeoman's work in terms of doing the transition that we all have to a digital, sort of a digital mindset in terms of communicating with applicants as well as onboarding. And I will just say as a last point, something to an earlier comment that I made around laws not keeping up with, the events of today. When I started, which was in the middle of this pandemic, we were given a pass or I'm not even sure what you would call it, to present our I-9 compliance. We were able to do it digitally. But effectively, as soon as regulations were lifted to a certain extent, everybody who was a recent hire needed to go to the facility to present a hard copy of their of some evidence of their I-9. You can imagine. I mean, we're dealing with everything in a virtual setting, and obviously there's security issues in terms of certifying what is effectively a photograph of a passport or anything in that regard. But as to the ongoing concerns that we have in terms of having a sort of disparate workforce, that I think there are technical elements just related to this aspect of onboarding, which need further discussion and further sort of planning around.
Thank you, guys. So that's, that's an interesting thread to pull. There might be some questions coming up. At this point, I'd like to start to take questions. You can either raise your hand, but it might be best if you can, and you're at your computer, to put the question into the chat. We have our first one already from Richard Lipset, who asks, how is the panel addressing remote workers that are relocating during this time as remote workers? So some folks might be saying, hey, I actually love this whole work from home gig. I think I want to stay that way. And how are you guys addressing that request?
We haven't gotten a specific request of that nature on our part. We definitely have a number of remote workers. We actually, I guess I should say, there is one example. We have a person who's actually a citizen of Denmark, and during this whole situation actually wanted to go back to Denmark. And of course, we want to keep that worker. So of course we allowed her to go back to Denmark. So I think we were trying to remain flexible, but we've had very few cases in our instance of having folks decide that once I'm remote, I think I'd like to stay remote and go somewhere else. But we are allowing the flexibility of folks to like the Denmark case. We are actually, there are folks actually now that they're working remotely, they're actually visiting home or visiting Taiwan or visiting other parts as part of their vacation, but also rolling in work. So it's actually an interesting dynamic now. We're seeing folks go visit their families in other parts of the world and stay remote. It's not they're moving there, but they're taking advantage of the fact that we can work us this way, and they stay connected and they stay working with us, which is different than obviously than it was before. So
What I'm hearing in this regard, and what I've actually experienced, because people wanting to work remote and or relocate and still be part of a business venture is not new. So maybe it's amplified because of the situation or because people have had more of a taste of what it's like, but it's not new. And the challenge for the business that I hear right now, and that I've had in the past, but more now, is a question of legally, can they let people go if they don't come back to work? So it's, yeah, it's all nice and good. People can work from home, great. But the truth is that the business still needs to produce the service and product. And if that remote activity isn't delivering the value that it was supposed to, it needs to be fixed. And if that fix requires them to be here, and that's not just coming into the facility, that can also be a time zone. I did a lot of work with London, a lot. And it was a nightmare interacting with them because they're awake when I'm asleep. You know what I mean? So a lot of those factors have to be considered as well. Sales is a pretty easy one to do remotely because people can pick up territories and do those kinds of things. Independent tasks like coding, you know, can be done, even some financial activities. But to the extent they have to interact with other people, you know, like in HR or others, you know, that may be on this time frame or in this location, that can be difficult to support. So I've got to boil down to what the CFO says.
in our Denmark case, actually, she's become a vampire. So she's actually completely switched her life where she's working at night.
I was like that. It's hard though.
So another question that's come up from Francis is, have any of the panelists had a COVID transmission or exposure on site? And if so, how did you guys handle it? Did you have defined processes, or did you rely on the CDC guidance? How did that go? If anybody's had that experience.
I guess we're fortunate to have not had a single case among any of our workers or their families, although we do have a guidance. We did set up sort of what would happen if, because everyone has to, I think. Everyone has to be responsible, understanding, well, if a family member or a close person, what are the sort of chains of events that we're going to do? We did follow, for the most part, the CDC guidance, but you know, obviously we like to err on the side of safety. So we tweaked that a little bit, but fortunate for us, we haven't had a single case in this whole time.
I think one thing to highlight when it comes to responding, you know, like Roger said, we've been fortunate and not had a positive case, but we have talked through and done sort of a fire drill of what would we do. Mm-hmm. And what that uncovered is that even though we thought we all knew what we would do, we weren't all sure we would know what we would do. You know, what if, for example, a subcontractor had somebody who was notified, or you know, what if somebody went home sick but maybe didn't get tested, or you know, a lot of, you know, what ifs. And so going through that kind of fire drill of what would you do if this happened was helpful, because what we found is that there was some misunderstandings, and doing that helped clarify those misunderstandings about how we would have to respond if something happened in a way that like gave us comfort and made us even more prepared. We haven't had to do that, but we know what we would do, and we were all communicating on the same page.
I think
we have actually had a couple of, oh, I'm sorry.
No, Dan. Daniel, go ahead.
Yeah. So So we have had a couple of cases. None of whom have been transmitted while on site. They've all had some kind of contact off site and then come on site either as asymptomatic or in one or two cases symptomatic. We have a very robust plan that was instituted and sort of iteratively developed at the start of this whole thing, but done anticipating that this was going to be a long-term affair. And thus we've been putting in protocols, building the plane as we're flying it, but ultimately putting in various protocols to create mitigation measures within the facility, whether that rely on social distancing and face coverings and cleansing and a myriad of other things. But we also have strict point of entry protocols, and that includes temperature checks for everybody, touchless entry, and have instituted systems for tracking who's coming in and out of the facility, regulating the number of people that can be in the facility at a given time. And that has been successful in terms of mitigating any potential spread on site. It's just it's a fact that there are. I mean, we not only have our employees on site, we have suppliers on site. There's construction going on, and the diversity of those personnel and the melting pot that is that collective workforce. Just the reality is that we've had to deal with positive cases, and I guess the one thing I can say to it is the planning that we did on the front end, the strike team that was identified across all the different operations, the buy-in from the executive team of every department to make certain concessions, I think is what has mitigated any additional cases from finding their way into the facility.
Thanks. George, I think you are also trying to jump in here.
What I was going to say is that initially and we have to understand that this is a learning process, and what we thought was the case in March is different than what we understand now. So we can't operate on science from March. You have to operate on what the science is now. And we've learned a lot. And so the real key is to start with education. People need to be educated as to what the real risks are. Not because really what all of my clients are dealing with isn't the danger of COVID. They're dealing with the fear. They have to mitigate the fear of their employees and the fear that the customers have so they can continue to do their interactions. And those fears are greatly mitigated through education. Now, they're not educating them. What they're doing is just saying, okay, well, if this makes you feel better, we're going to do this and we'll split you apart. But I mean, we've had cases, I mean, I haven't had any near me or anything, although I do have a friend of mine who's a police officer who actually had to, handle somebody who had COVID, and then he had to get tested, and then there were so many days, et cetera. But it didn't transmit at the speed that we initially thought it would, which is great. I mean, I'm very grateful. But like I said, the real issue is around all of this is, one, how do we educate people so they're not afraid of things that aren't real? I'm not saying there aren't things to be afraid of, but I'm just saying don't add to it. The second thing is, and this is something that we're dealing with, I'll just mention it here, is that even with the systems we've been asked to put in, like thermal imaging, temperature, all those kinds of things, there's another side to that. The legal department says, you can't tell, if you tell somebody that, oh, there was someone here that had it, you can't tell them who, because that's a violation of their privacy. So, those kinds of, you have to really be careful there. It's, anyway, so that's kind of what we've experienced with it.
I'm going to jump in on this one a little bit too, because I helped put together some of the plans for NASA Ames and NASA Armstrong out here on the West Coast. And we've dealt with a couple of symptomatic individuals and possible transmissions, even through rather extreme amounts of personal protective equipment. So, some things that really came out of this in my research, and having to develop an understanding. I'm not a biologist. I'm a physicist by training. Roger and I have more in common than I do with my doctor. But necessity, mother of invention, and action. So often, as I went and I read up. So when a lot of the things, as George said, we think we should do this, but really it should be that. A lot of the people, I don't want to cut into your business, George, but it's really funny about the thermal imagers, right? The correlation between thermal imagers and oral temperature is actually very poor, to the point where the medical community does not accept it. So you have these businesses that are deciding who gets to go have lunch based off of what the medical community is throwing out. And then, when it came to testing, there was a question that came up repeatedly amongst our working teams. If somebody tests negative, can we just allow them on site the next day? Could be a critical worker, could be somebody in the critical path, and important. Our doctor, our flight surgeon, the chief medical officer for the center is always a flight surgeon because we do space flight. He said, no, guys, I don't care about negative tests because they are 50% false positive or false negative, right? So half the time a negative test is wrong. I said, and so of course we asked, what about the positives then? Well, the positives are 80 to 90% correct. So if somebody pops positive, they've got COVID. But if they shows negative, we still have to hold them out for the full quarantine time. So it goes back to education, really understanding what the literature is saying, and going to basically going to the source. And that, I think that's just one of the key learnings through this whole situation in terms of how we manage it. Now I've got a few more questions, and so the next few I'm going to ask for if the panel can just be a bit quick hitting, because we're coming on to just 10 minutes left. Brian Wiffley asks, what are folks hearing about successes and or failures in coping with children and the lack of schooling in some parts? I mean, in other parts of the country, schools have reopened fully. In California, it's kind of catch can. Some daycares are open, some not. It's a mixed bag. How are your employees dealing with it? How's your company handled it?
I think just trying to maintain as much flexibility as possible, understanding the situation. And it goes definitely, without schools and childcare open, it creates a lot of extra burden and stress for many of our employees. And so trying to be as flexible as we can with, working hours or any other support we can give people, and, trying to, especially, highlighting in communications between managers and staff and everyone that, that open communication is helpful, and we'll try to be as flexible as we can to accommodate this challenging time has been really important.
Yeah, what I've heard is that to a great extent, the people that are working from home and haven't been, who have children and now the children are there, is that it's impacting work quality. So
I agree with that. I got a 3.5-year-old, Daniel. I think when we chatted earlier, you had your little 5-month-old beautiful little boy on your lap. In fact, my little girl's napping, and if she comes and crawls into my lap, it just is what it is.
Yeah, and I think we just have to be honest about it. These are not optimal situations. We can't, make it all perfect. Like, wow, it's so great. They're at home, let's stay there. Or that the kids are there. It's impacting the quality of the services and things that we're doing. And I think that, I think it's okay we mitigate it for, let's say, through the end of the year. But these are not long-term things. They can't be. The schools or some type of activity, some way of freeing up people to be able to focus on different types of activities has to happen. So at least that's the feedback I'm getting from all the companies that I'm interacting with right now.
At this point, I'd just like to ask, because I know there's some people possibly dialed in on the phone who may not be able to type. So I just wanted to see if anybody wanted to jump in with a voice question before we moved on with other questions. Do we have anybody?
I have one.
Hey there, Jonathan.
Hey, so to George's point, like my big question is on the panel. We talked about a lot of internal issues that we're somewhat able to control, but like to George's point, like there's also like those external factors, and I'm fascinated with Daniel and his endeavors in Arizona, being a former legislator there. They're building a $700 million facility in Casa Grande. And so, like, obviously, there's a lot of benchmarks to make sure, like, the building goes up to when the vehicle rolls off the line, to work in the communities and make those benchmarks during these challenging times. But I feel like for everybody, one of those challenging things, and going back to George, is like the education system. Everything you've just said in this panel is something that schools are trying to address. And like Daniel said, policy is very slow. But I just, parents are trying to do their jobs, and if we push people back to work, schools might not be open. And how are we gonna, solve that solution? Is anybody working with the governor's office, chambers of commerce, on developing that plan kind of for the overall communities?
I'll jump in and just say I think I want to be cognizant of the fact that this panel is all male, and frankly that does invariably have sort of a bias towards some of these issues related to working. I think that one of the major silver linings of being in this, if everybody being in this situation, is that it is everybody. And so finding where we can make concessions, where we can make accommodations that do have a longer impact, is ultimately to the betterment of not only the workforce in total, but to each of our companies, in terms of being able to retain talent and being able to bring in the best and brightest. What curbs that ability is the lack of focus on the education system and childcare as a whole, by the various levels of government that we have today. And as Zahir noted, this is very personal for me with a 3-year-old and a 5-month-old. But if you note the displeasure in my voice, it's that there has been a disconnect between childcare and schooling and the business community. And that's an obvious statement, writ large, for all kinds of things. But as it specifically relates to this issue, I think that we're seeing this in real time in terms of how this specific disconnect is going to impact businesses that are trying to bring more people back to work, or basically just getting back to the normal flow of business. Jonathan, I can't honestly speak very eloquently about the interaction between schools and the local community at the factory. We're benefited greatly by virtue of the fact that construction was never inhibited there, so we're continuing to roll. But I do think it's serendipitous to a degree that we've yet to hire a majority of our workforce for that facility, because if we were in the closer stages towards production, I think we have a very hard time with this exact issue, given the demand to have everybody associated with the production line on site in close quarters, with the inability of maintaining a 6-foot distance apart. Right. This is a long way of saying I think we are still skirting some very tricky issues that we're all going to have with our respective businesses. And there are some key components which have been neglected to this point, and maybe neglected is the wrong word, but we simply don't have answers to, that are going to be distractions, if not major issues with actually achieving real progress on this front.
Awesome. Now we've only got a few minutes left, so if I could ask, there are a couple more questions, and if I could just ask one panelist to just grab it, and then we'll move on to the next question, if that's okay. Now, Raj, an MGM student at Thunderbird, he's asking about considering the current situation, how is your company driving innovation and R&D discussions remotely? Any specific tools or processes that you have found to be exceptionally useful?
We obviously, on our side, continue to use these kinds of virtual things to do most of our work, but there are the occasional times where we're actually trying to get folks in the building, appropriately social distance and interacting. I agree with George. There's just certain things that that have to happen person to person. And some of the creative things we do, we've been able to do a decent job, but occasionally if the team captain thinks the team needs to get together, that's what they'll do. That's just a fact of life. And it's hard to replace that interaction in person for some of these more creative brainstorming tasks.
Thank you, Roger. And then another question is, how are you monitoring stress and well-being on your teams? Anybody want to jump on that?
I think I'll jump on that one. I think back to communication at a lot of different levels is important. I think we've also, since the beginning, been focusing on, we kind of created like a little employee engagement sub-team. And besides just doing all of our business stuff remotely, we've added in to try to continue some of the more fun and team building stuff we've done, remotely, having, the kind of the remote happy hour things. We've been continuing to do, virtual yoga classes and meditation. We started one of our colleagues started a craft program for people's kids, to try to engage not just the employees but their families, and then encouraging people to take vacation. It seems even harder to disconnect now that home and office are the same dining table. But encouraging people to get out and take vacation, even if it's just disconnecting for a day, have been ways we've been trying to help people manage stress.
Well, we're at 7 o'clock. Just a few seconds short. So first, I just want to thank you, Ben, Roger, George, and Daniel from Allogene, Triple Ring, TechZero, and Lucid, respectively. Thank you guys so very much for taking this time out of your evenings at home from your children, family, spouses, etc., to share your experiences and ideas with us today. I'm Zahir Ali. Thank you. I also want to thank our audience for attending. Your questions and interaction have been wonderful. This has really been a great discussion. We have been recording it, and so for folks who had people who couldn't attend or would like to share this later, that will be available. We're going to be email blasting everybody who signed up with that link and some other materials about COVID risk and some research that can be done. And before I sign off and we all sign off, I just want to turn it over to Valerie Boyle, our outgoing chair of the board for the Newark Chamber of Commerce, who has done an amazing job for many years leading that. And she is soon to ride off into the sunset. This might be her last webinar. So Valerie, if you would like to close us out, please. Valerie, you're still on mute. Do you want me to unmute you?
I've unmuted myself.
All right, great.
All right. Yeah, I just wanted to take a moment to and mirror what Zahir has just said. First of all, Zahir, thank you so much. You have done a really fabulous job working with some of our team, but gathering together such interesting and informational individuals here, professional individuals from our community with very different types of businesses. I personally have found this to be just incredibly interesting and informing. So I want to thank each one of you gentlemen, Ben, Roger, Daniel, George. It's been a very fast-paced and enjoyable hour and a half. And so we, from the Chamber especially, do thank you for your time and sharing your experiences of what is happening with you, talking about supply chains, education, productivity, remote work, childcare. These are our ongoing issues. Some are going to resolve themselves more quickly than others. I do think, Daniel, you had a point about unless some serious solutions come to play, which are going to take a lot of different input from a lot of different people for childcare and education. This is a sort of snowball rolling down the hill still that can impact our businesses because we can't all leave the children with no one to watch them. So we're all, I can tell, very caring individuals. We're parents. We have employees who have those issues too. It's been a really fascinating discussion. I hope a lot of people will listen to this after the fact. I think I'm going to listen to it again just because I enjoyed it so much. But our great thanks to all of you for your time. Zahir, again, thank you to you.
All right, folks, once again, thank you for this evening. And at this point, we'll let everyone get to their dinners. Good evening, good night, and look for info about the next New York Chamber of Commerce webinar.
Good night, Zahir.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Good night, everyone.